Dear students, welcome to this lecture. Today's topic for discussion is Model of John Galtung to understand conflict, violence and conflict resolution. The main objectives of today's lecture are to know briefly the life sketch of John Galtung and his contribution to peace studies, to understand the triangular model ABC of John Galtung, to understand the types of violence in Model of John Galtung, to have a look as how the simple conflict turns into violence, and finally to understand the contemporary civil war in Syria through the model of John Galtung. Dear students, let's start with the introduction. John Vincent Galtung was born in Oslo in Norway in 1930. His father was a physician and he attended the military services during the war. Along with her sister, Galtung received the elementary education in the hometown only. He completed his degree in mathematics at the University of Oslo in 1956 and a year later, PhD in sociology at the same university. He was appointed as assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at Columbia University. John Galtung was at the core of the group of intellectuals behind the establishment of Peace Research Institute of Oslo, or PRIO, in 1959. Without Galtung's enormous effort and personality, PRIO would never have come true. John Galtung was the founding editor of Journal of Peace Research in 1964. Galtung left PRIO in 1969 to become professor of conflict and peace studies at the University of Oslo. He maintained informal ties to the institute for some time after his departure. For the last decades, however, he had little contact with PRIO and has not had any formal links to the institution. In 1993, John Galtung and Fumiko Nishimuro founded conflict mediation organization called Transcend. From his early age, he was influenced by people working on the path of non-violence. One such figure was Mahatma Gandhi. The assassination of Mahatma Gandhi on 30th January 1948 had great impact on his personality, which he describes as, I quote, "When Gandhi was shot on 30th January 1948, I found myself crying, much to my puzzlement and dismay. I was 17 and 17-year-olds don't cry, and a boy to boot. And it wasn't the habit of mine to cry. Somehow or other, Gandhi's message had affected me so deeply that I reacted in this unexpected way." Unquote. As the founder of the discipline of peace and conflict studies, John Galtung has outspokenly advocated for a world without nuclear weapons and has placed the focus of research on scientific terminologies and methods to understand and deal with conflicts. Having coined the term peace research, Galtung has devoted much of his time in formulating the influential and unique Transcend approach, wherein the focus is on peace rather than security. He has advocated for a model that is holistic and is based on deep understanding and dialogue with one party at a time. The underlying cause of any violence, according to Galtung, is an unresolved conflict, one that has not been transformed or transcended due to existence of incompatible goals. If the goals are among the four basic needs of survival, well-being, identity, or freedom, the conflict is then concluded to be deep and most difficult to resolve if left unattended. It's important to remember that a conflict does not progress linearly, but rather goes around in circle, though a cycle of non-violence to violence, then to post-violence, and likely back to its first level. The escalation of conflict to a violent level is largely a result of disequilibrium among the actors or parties involved, leading to polarization and dehumanization of the other, and finally reflected in their aggression, the output of which is violence. What follows violence is traumatization and consequently acts of revenge, leading the cycle of conflict back to its first level. Dear students, let's have a look at Galtung's first model, which is also referred as ABC triangle. The ABC triangle was developed by John Galtung. This has three aspects: the attitude of the actors involved, their behavior, and contradiction. The contradiction is defined by actors involved in terms of incompatible values or goals between them. The three aspects are interrelated, and any one of them may be the starting point for development of a conflict. An incompatibility in goals, for example, over a territory may lead to hostile attitudes, then behavior. It is also the case that hostile behavior can lead to hostile attitudes and create an incompatibility of goals. Likewise, hostile attitudes between actors can result in behavior that creates an incompatibility of goals. What at first is simple proposition that a conflict can start at one of the 3 points becomes more complex when we consider what the attitudes, behavior, and contradiction are and how they are actually interrelated. The ABC triangle is an excellent model for both the beginners and the experts to use when attempting to understand a given conflict. This is because the original model is straightforward and the non-specialist can apply it in order to understand what the underlying contradiction is, the attitudes to each other of actors involved, and their behavior as a result of the contradiction and attitudes. As the analysis can begin using any of the aspects as a starting point, there is potential for the analyst to identify what is driving the conflict and how the conflict can be de-escalated. An example is territory, a frequent focus of conflict, as while a dispute over territory is clear incompatibility of goals, an analysis of attitudes and behavior may reveal that the territory itself is not important to the actors, but their wish to keep it out of others' hand of other is revealing that the source of conflict lays in their attitudes to each other and drives their behavior. A second advantage of the model is that it can be applied to all types of conflict and multiple actors, and so a genuinely general model in its application. The model is also very adaptable as it encourages the analyst to consider exactly what the nature of attitudes, behavior, and contradictions are, so encouraging the application of expert knowledge. Taking attitude as an example, a psychologist will have a wealth of specialist knowledge which they can apply to understanding the attitude aspect of the conflict triangle. This in itself will aid an understanding of only one aspect, but collaboration with other specialists, for example, sociologists and historians, will reveal more about other aspects. Put simply, the model can be used by you and I, people in conflict situations, and specialists, all using the same model as a point of reference. The ABC triangle can be as straightforward or complex as the user decides. Another triangle which Galtung has proposed is that of related to types of violence. While stating that two types of violence, direct and structural, are to be considered as the starting point of strategy for peaceful resolution, Galtung also defined a third category of violence, namely the cultural violence. Direct violence is an event that is often quick and visible, reflecting the capabilities and intentions of actors to engage in a conflict. It includes a victim and a perpetrator and can be seen explicitly in societies. Structural violence, on the other hand, is a process that is slow and often invisible. It refers to the injustice and inequality built into the structural institutions of the society. It's reflective of a position, higher up or lower down in the hierarchy of exploitation, repression, alienation, where the parties involved are determined either to keep the hierarchy intact or to completely obliterate it. An example of structural violence as seen from top-down approach would include colonial aspirations of European nations. In the case of India and British Empire, the aggression from top exists in the form of material exploitation at the hands of later. It became visible once the natives demonstrated their will to oppose colonialism and break the hierarchy of exploitation. Cultural violence refers to those aspects of culture that can be used to legitimize or justify both structural and direct violence. It renders the use of violence as acceptable in the society and makes it okay for actors to use violence without making them feel guilty. In a brilliant example, Galtung talks about how the internalization of culture makes it morally easier for actors to employ violence, such as in the interpretation in case of murder on behalf of one's countries being seen as right. In the case of direct and structural violence faced by immigrants, it's the culture that allows for such violence to be tolerated. The cultural violence in this case justifies the indirect and direct violence by dehumanizing the immigrants and portraying them as thugs or aliens. It allows societies to tolerate policies of forced child separation while continuing to deny them equitable means of living. Dear students, Galtung also puts forth before us as how the conflict can turn into violence. Violence is most often an outcome of deprivation of needs. The more basic and non-negotiable the needs, the likelier chances there is for aggression to come into existence. While classifying the basic needs into four broad categories of survival, welfare, freedom, and identity, Galtung warns his readers against prioritizing any one need over the other. To put survival above freedom and identity would result in repression and alienation, failing to end structural and cultural violence. When the goal of an actor A is incompatible with that of actor B, such that it obstructs the attainment of goal by actor B, the pursuit of such goals would then most likely result in frustration among both actors, the consequence of which would be polarization of the two extremes. Polarization would imply a zero-sum game, where the scope of transcendence is low and the likely outcome is a position of no compromise. Because the contradiction in goals is absolute, the victory of actor A would thus necessarily imply loss of actor B. Polarization, accompanied by dehumanization of the other, may galvanize into hostility and hatred, manifesting itself into aggressive behavior, finally resulting in escalation. The conflict, however, does not stop at violence. What follows violence is traumatization of victims harmed by violence, breeding acts of revenge. In an actor conflict, the polarization between two sides can almost immediately lead to direct violence. This is because actor A, who has incompatible goals with actor B, can easily identify the object or subject of obstruction of attainment of its goals. Therefore, what follows is violent behavior by actor A towards actor B. On the other hand, in a structural conflict, polarization may result in acute disequilibrium between rank positions of members in a society. However, Galtung, in his essay on the structural theory of aggression, argues that violence is unlikely to occur unless all methods of maintaining equilibrium have been tried and unless culture facilitates violence, wherein those lower down are constantly reminded of their position and their consequent mistreatment. A system of injustice or inequity which refuses to break the hierarchy of oppression and exploitation would likely result in frustration, the outburst of which would be reflected in the form of violence. The often visible Naxalite violence in India can be seen as a result of deep-rooted structural violence where the parties involved have suffered exploitation and marginalization due to unequal economic development and inequitable distribution of resources for years. On the other hand, the genocide that took place against the members of Rohingya community in Myanmar is a crude example of direct violence, but were eventually labeled as Bangladeshi immigrants. Years of discrimination led to their ethnic cleansing. They were murdered, raped, and evicted from their homeland. It took only one law which rendered them stateless for the majority of Myanmar to consider them as subhumans and readily accept the atrocities committed against them. Dear students, it will be useful to us to analyze the ongoing conflict in Syria from Galtung's model. The civil war in Syria is unfortunately an example of one of the bloodiest conflicts of this century. However, when approached from Galtung's conflict theory, the conflict can be divided into three categories of violence: direct, structural, and cultural. Dear students, let's understand the form of direct violence as defined by Galtung in case of Syria. Syrians have been the victims of decades-long political repression in the form of restrictions on freedom of speech and expression, torture, and enforced disappearances. The political institutions have historically been unstable, with 3 military coups taking place in 1949 alone, followed by one more in 1954, in addition to the Ba'athist-led coups in 1963 and 1966. The Syrian security forces are known to have detained citizens without proper warrants even before 2010, many of whom have reportedly been tortured in prisons. In their attempts to keep the hierarchy of power relations intact, the centralized institutions are known to clamp down on any public demonstration with frequent arrests and employment of state violence. For example, in 2011, 15 school-going children, all under the age of 17, were reportedly arrested and tortured for writing anti-graffiti on a wall leading to protests of 2011. The government responded by opening fire on the peaceful protesters, killing 4 civilians. More than 4 lakh people have died because of Syrian conflict since 2011, with 5 million seeking refuge abroad and over 6 million displaced internally. While soldiers supporting the Syrian president and opposition armed groups continue to remain prominent actors, recent years have seen rise of Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliated members. The war has also seen a large-scale presence of 2 categories of foreign actors: those supporting the Syrian regime like Iran and Russia, and those who continue to be key rebel supporters, for example, United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. All of these actors have their motives and intentions of being engaged in the war. Dear students, there is existing structural violence in Syria for many years. While countries continue to witness the horrors of visible atrocities and war crimes, the underlying layers of structural violence continue to buttress the egregious brutality which is often more direct and physical. Although war is often seen as a result of outbursts of pro-democracy protests in 2011, a close examination of countries' socio-economic structure would enable one to get a detailed insight into underlying layers of frustration caused due to large-scale poverty, inequality and marginalization. The injustice and inequality built into the structural institutions of the Syrian society can be referred to what has been called as the structural violence by John Galtung. The violence here is reflective of a position higher up or lower down in hierarchy of exploitation, repression, alienation, where the parties involved are determined either to keep the hierarchy intact or to completely obliterate it. In the case of Syria, the deprivation of most basic and non-negotiable needs which threaten the citizens' need for survival has been primary cause for the aggression to come into existence. The factors that thus lead to conflict in Syria can be seen rooted in the years of repression, poverty and lack of representative institutions, which manifest in the form of protests or Arab Spring in 2011. Years of conflict have increased the economic crisis, pushing both the state and its citizens into chaos, with more than 80% of Syrian population living below poverty line, with an unemployment rate of at least 55% in 2018. With most of the business networks now being controlled by selected few elites, the population at large continues to suffer brunt of both structural and direct violence. There is also cultural violence in Syria. The cultural violence in Syria, like elsewhere, is most often perpetrated in the form of sensitization of language, where years of structural violence are termed as mere discrimination and where civilians are seen as mere targets to be killed. Additionally, cultural violence in the form of ideology and religion has helped to sustain violence in the region. Religion here has acted as a form of cultural violence, while the fight is between the chosen and the unchosen. In Syria, this fight has taken the form of sectarian divisions between the minority Alawi community and majority Sunni population. The legitimization of violence at the hands of state is rooted in its fight against extremism, which depends upon the promulgation of the narrative that all rebel forces have the same ulterior motive of building an intolerant Islamic caliphate. State's reliance on its alleged effort to curb extremism has allowed its forces to justify the use of heavy artillery, the bombardment of residential places, and subsequent massacres. Another factor that helps explain the sustenance of violence in its normalization, where violence is seen as natural and a part of everyday life. Decades of repression in Syria have helped to normalize torture and rampant arrests and restrictions. Dear students, while concluding today's lecture, we can say that it has attempted to explain the theory of conflict as proposed by John Galtung. It has taken into account Galtung's two triangles of conflict. First, the attitudes, behavior, contradiction triangle, which seeks to explain the notion of conflict and demonstrates how a conflict consists of all the three, with attitudes and contradictions existing at the latent level, manifesting themselves into violent behavior which is conscious and visible. The second triangle divides violence into three broad categories of direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence, and it demonstrates how the latter two facilitate and bring about direct violence. This lecture has also attempted to employ Galtung's theory of conflict to explain the civil war in Syria, where it has identified three categories of violence and has tried to apply the theory into practice. Dear students, this was all about today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.